Imagine you're a delivery driver cruising down empty streets in the dead of night. It's just another late shift, until you reach the address that changes everything. You pull up to an old, decaying house at the end of a forgotten road, a house that seems to breathe darkness. The air is thick, cold, and something feels wrong. But it's just a delivery, right? Drop the package and leave. Simple. Only, as you step closer, you catch a glimpse of something. Someone watching from the shadows within. A figure, pale and silent, whose eyes seem to call you in, or maybe warn you away. This was the night that would haunt Mike forever, a night that bound him to the restless spirit of 478 Glencoe Road, and a mystery darker than any he could imagine. Welcome to a story where the shadows watch and sometimes they follow. The routine delivery. Mike had been working as a delivery driver for Amazon for almost 2 years. He was familiar with every corner of his assigned route, and most of his deliveries were to the usual suburban houses, apartment complexes, and businesses. However, there was one particular area, a lonely, rundown stretch of neighborhood, that he seldom visited. Houses there were far apart, many of them looked abandoned, and people rarely placed orders from that area. He and his colleagues called it no man's land. It was late October, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time Mike was close to finishing his shift. That night, a chill in the air hinted at the coming winter, and the sky was cloaked in a heavy overcast, blocking any moonlight that might have softened the night's darkness. As he glanced at his delivery app for his final stop, Mike's heart sank a little. The destination was marked deep within no man's land. He sighed, trying to shrug off his discomfort. Just one more drop and I'm done for the day, he muttered to himself, attempting to shake the uneasy feeling creeping over him. With a sigh, he turned his truck down a narrow, poorly lit road that led to the isolated neighborhood. The house was marked as 478 Glencoe Road, and the app directions showed it was another 5 minutes down the twisting lane. As he drove deeper into the desolate neighborhood, the houses became fewer and further apart. Overgrown trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches twisting like skeletal arms above his vehicle. The lights from nearby homes faded until it was just his truck's headlights slicing through the thickening darkness. Finally, he saw the house. It was barely illuminated by the faint glow of his headlights and sat back from the road, hidden behind tall, unkempt bushes and towering oaks. The place looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The front porch sagged under the weight of years, and the windows were streaked with grime, casting faint reflections that danced in the shadows. Something about the house felt off. The house wasn't just old, it seemed to radiate a sense of emptiness and abandonment, as if it had been neglected for far too long. But the delivery instructions were clear. Deliver to the doorstep of 478 Glencoe Road. Leave a photo as proof. The encounter. Mike parked the truck on the narrow gravel path that led up to the house. The crunch of his footsteps seemed unusually loud as he approached the front porch. An eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves from a cold autumn breeze. There were no other sounds, no distant hum of traffic, no animal calls, just an oppressive quietness that seemed to absorb every other noise. He stepped up onto the rickety porch, noting how the wood groaned under his weight. He reached out to knock on the door out of habit, even though he knew no one would likely answer. His knuckles barely touched the old wood when he heard a faint creak from inside. He paused, straining to hear, but all was silent again. Must be the wind, he told himself, though his voice sounded oddly hollow in the stillness. He placed the package down, took a step back, and raised his phone to snap a photo. His finger was hovering over the shutter button when something caught his eye, a slight movement in the upper left window. He froze, staring up at the glass. For a brief moment, he could have sworn he saw a shadow move across the window, a dark figure there 1 second, gone the next. He blinked and shook his head, trying to clear the image from his mind. Just tired, he muttered under his breath, but his hands trembled slightly as he took the picture. Just as he was about to turn and head back to his truck, he felt his phone vibrate. The delivery app notification flashed across his screen, but it wasn't a standard message. This one simply read, "Don't leave." He frowned, puzzled. He hadn't seen a notification like that before. It could have been a glitch or maybe a new feature he wasn't aware of. Shrugging it off, he took a few steps away from the house, glancing back one last time. The warning. As he reached his truck and climbed inside, he saw another notification pop up on his phone screen. His eyes went wide in disbelief. It was another message, this time from an unknown number, and it read, "You're not alone, Mike. She's watching you." A chill ran down his spine as he read the words. How did someone know his name? He quickly glanced around, scanning the shadows that cloaked the yard and the surrounding woods. There was no one there, or at least no one that he could see. Trying to shake off his rising anxiety, he checked the time. It was late and he just wanted to go home. He placed the phone in the cup holder, started the engine, and began to reverse down the driveway. As he did, he caught a glimpse of something in his rearview mirror. Standing by the front door was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, but her outline was unmistakable. She stood perfectly still, hands at her sides, staring in his direction. He felt his throat tighten, his pulse hammering in his chest. He quickly looked over his shoulder, trying to confirm what he'd seen. But there was no one there, just the empty porch and the old, weathered door slightly ajar. His heart raced as he looked back at the mirror, but now the woman was gone. Without wasting another second, Mike hit the gas and sped down the driveway, leaving the house behind. He didn't look back until he was halfway down the road, his headlights finally illuminating the familiar, slightly comforting sight of other houses in the distance. The night after, Mike reached home that night feeling drained. He couldn't shake the memory of the eerie figure in the doorway, nor could he explain the strange messages he'd received. But he told himself it was probably just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. After all, he'd been working long hours lately, and it was easy to imagine things after a day like that. He tried to unwind, sitting on his couch with a beer in hand and the TV flickering in the background. But even with the noise, he couldn't shake a strange, suffocating feeling. It was as if the silence of that house had followed him, clinging to him like a shadow. Later, as he was getting ready for bed, his phone buzzed again. His stomach twisted. The thought of another message sent an irrational fear through him, yet he told himself it was probably nothing. Trying to stay calm, he picked up his phone. This time, the message was an image, a photo of the very house he'd visited earlier that night. The angle was taken from the driveway with the porch visible, and in the corner of the picture, there was that same shadowy figure. Her face was still hidden, but the figure's dark outline was unmistakable. She was staring directly at the camera. Mike's blood ran cold. He hadn't taken this picture. And worse, he noticed a timestamp on the photo indicating that it had been taken less than 15 minutes ago. Who's doing this? He whispered to himself, his voice barely a murmur. His first instinct was to call someone, anyone, just to feel a sense of safety. But he wasn't sure who to call. Who would believe him? In the end, he settled on trying to brush it off as a prank, a very elaborate, unsettling prank. He turned off his phone and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come easily. The haunting begins. The next few days passed uneventfully, and Mike began to convince himself that the strange events had been a one-time thing. But that peace didn't last long. One night, as he was closing up the truck at the end of his shift, he heard a strange sound from the back, a low, muffled whisper. He stopped and turned, trying to listen. The whispering grew louder, coming from inside the truck itself. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was filled with anger or maybe desperation. His heart raced as he slowly opened the back door, his flashlight ready. The whispering stopped instantly, leaving only the unsettling silence of the empty storage space. Shaking his head, he closed the truck and returned to his car. But as he drove away, he caught sight of something in his rearview mirror again. A shadow standing in the dim glow of the streetlight by his truck. It was that same figure staring after him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. That night, as he tried to sleep, he was haunted by faint whispers that seemed to drift through his room. At first, he thought they were only in his head. But as he lay there, he noticed that they seemed to come from one specific direction, the corner of his room just out of sight. He didn't dare look. Instead, he buried his face in his pillow, praying for the whispering to stop. But it continued throughout the night, a relentless murmur that sounded like a voice from the grave, researching the house. The next morning, exhausted and frustrated, Mike decided he needed answers. He couldn't go on like this. Something strange was happening, and he felt as though he was losing his grip on reality. Desperate for clarity, he began researching the house at 478 Glencoe Road. He spent hours online, searching through records and archives until he finally found something. A news article from nearly 2 decades ago. The house had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Gray, a recluse who rarely ventured outside. According to the article, Eleanor was rumored to practice strange rituals and had claimed to hear voices that no one else could hear. The article continued to describe how she'd gone missing one winter, and her body had never been found. The neighbors had filed complaints for years about eerie noises and strange figures seen around the property, even after the house had been vacated. Eventually, the house was left to decay, and no one had dared to buy it since. Mike's hands trembled as he read. It was as if Eleanor was somehow still lingering around her old home, bound to the place by forces beyond comprehension. And now, for some reason, she'd latched onto him. But why? The return to 478 Glencoe Road. Despite his fear, Mike knew he had to return to the house. He couldn't explain it, but a part of him felt that it was the only way to end this nightmare. That night, just before the end of his shift, he drove back down the familiar path toward 478 Glencoe Road. The house looked even more foreboding than before, its sagging porch and grimy windows looming like the empty eyes of a skull. Mike parked his truck, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The night air was colder than usual, and a thick fog had settled around the house, muffling all sound. He approached the porch, heart pounding, and called out softly, "Eleanor, are you here?" For a moment there was nothing. Then he heard it, a faint whisper drifting out from the darkness within the house. It was her voice, soft and broken, repeating a single phrase over and over. "I'm still here. I'm still here." The sound chilled him to the bone, but he forced himself to move forward. Slowly he reached for the door handle, pushing it open. The door creaked on its hinges, and he was greeted by the stale, musty air of a place left untouched for years. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the faint moonlight that seeped in through the broken windows. Inside, the house was frozen in time, filled with the relics of a life abandoned. Old furniture, draped in sheets, lined the walls, and faded photos hung crookedly on the peeling wallpaper. Mike's flashlight swept over the room, landing on a narrow hallway that stretched deeper into the house. He stepped forward, heart pounding, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The whispering grew louder as he made his way down the hall, and with every step, he felt as though he was being watched. Finally, he reached the end of the hallway and found himself standing before a door. Confronting the darkness, Mike stood in front of the door, his hand hovering over the worn brass doorknob. The whispers had grown louder, filling the space around him with an almost tangible presence. The words were still indistinct, but he could feel the emotion behind them: desperation, sorrow, anger. It was as though the very walls of the house were alive, pulsing with Eleanor's pain and fury. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room on the other side was small and almost completely empty, save for an old wooden chair in the center. Dust and cobwebs coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. But what caught Mike's attention was the figure seated in the chair. It was her. The shadowy woman he'd glimpsed before, but now he could see her in horrifying detail. Eleanor's form was thin and ghostly, her skin pale and almost translucent. Her eyes were empty voids, black and endless, staring straight through him with a look of pure agony. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her hands were twisted, gnarled, as though they'd been clenched in anger for years. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Eleanor raised her head, her empty eyes meeting his. "Why have you come back?" Her voice was soft, like a whisper carried on a cold wind, yet it echoed through the room with a haunting clarity. Mike felt his throat tighten, fear rooting him to the spot. But he forced himself to respond. I want to help you. I don't know why you're haunting me, but if there's something I can do to end this, please tell me." Eleanor's gaze hardened, and she let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You think you can help me?" she whispered. "I've been trapped here, in this place, for so long. No one can free me. Not now. Mike swallowed, desperation clawing at him. There must be a way. What happened to you? Why are you still here? Eleanor's face twisted with sorrow. She looked down at her hands, almost as if she was seeing them for the first time, and her voice grew distant. I was left here, abandoned by those who swore to care for me. I was alone night after night, hearing voices that no one else could hear. They thought I was mad, left me here to suffer, until my body gave in. Her words were laced with bitterness, and the air around them seemed to thicken with her anguish. Mike's heart ached with sympathy, but he was also gripped by a mounting dread. Whatever pain had bound her to this house, it had twisted her spirit into something dark, something dangerous. Eleanor, if I could do something to give you peace, I would, he said, his voice shaking. Just tell me what you need. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, she rose from the chair, her movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. She stepped toward him, and the temperature in the room dropped, each breath turning to mist in the air. Promise me, you'll remember me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Promise me you won't let them forget what they did. Mike nodded, feeling a strange sense of obligation. I promise, Eleanor. I'll remember. A flicker of something, perhaps relief, perhaps gratitude, passed over her face. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone, replaced by the hollow emptiness that had consumed her. Suddenly, Eleanor's figure began to fade, her form dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Her voice echoed one last time, a mournful whisper that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Thank you. I can finally rest. And then she was gone. The room was silent once more, and the oppressive weight that had filled the house lifted, leaving only a hollow emptiness behind. The aftermath. Mike staggered back out of the house, feeling as though he'd just emerged from a nightmare. The sky was beginning to lighten, and the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon. He took a deep breath, letting the cold morning air fill his lungs, grounding him in reality once more. As he returned to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that something within him had changed. He no longer felt the weight of Eleanor's presence, nor the strange sense of being watched. It was as if she had truly moved on, leaving him in peace. In the days that followed, Mike tried to go back to his normal routine. He continued his delivery routes, though he avoided Glencoe Road whenever possible. He kept his promise, telling the story of Eleanor Gray to anyone who would listen, ensuring her memory would not be forgotten. But even as he moved on with his life, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left a part of himself in that house, bound to the memories of a soul who had finally found peace after years of torment. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the trees and shadows crept across his room, he sometimes wondered if Eleanor was still there, watching over him from the other side, a silent guardian, finally at rest. Shadows of the past. It had been months since Mike's encounter at 478 Glencoe Road, and though he had returned to his regular life, his experience with Eleanor had left a lasting impact. At first, he found himself haunted by vivid memories, echoes of her face, the faint sound of her whispering voice. But as time passed, the memories began to fade, settling into a place somewhere between fear and understanding. Mike no longer worked as an Amazon delivery driver. He'd left that job a few weeks after the incident, feeling he needed a change. He had taken a quieter job as a night security guard at a nearby complex. The hours were long and the work was solitary, but it gave him a strange sense of comfort. The darkness no longer frightened him as it once had. He understood it now, its secrets, its mysteries. It was almost as if he were closer to it, bound by an unspoken kinship. On the anniversary of his encounter, Mike felt an unexplainable pull to return to Glencoe Road. He hadn't been back there since that night, but something in him wanted to see the place again, to close the chapter with a sense of finality. So, on a quiet, overcast evening, he drove down the old road, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread as he neared the house. When he arrived, he found the place even more dilapidated than he remembered. Weeds and ivy had overtaken the yard, and the house itself seemed to be sinking into the ground, as if it were finally succumbing to the pull of the earth. The windows were broken, and the front door hung open, creaking in the faint breeze. As he stood in front of the house, Mike felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He closed his eyes, breathing in the cool air, letting the silence settle around him. And then, for a brief moment, he thought he heard it, the faintest whisper like a sigh drifting on the wind. "Thank you." The voice was softer than a breath, barely audible, but it sent a wave of peace through him. He opened his eyes, feeling lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. Mike turned and walked back to his car, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. He knew he would never forget Eleanor or the promise he'd made, but now, it felt like she was truly at rest, her spirit finally freed from the lonely prison of that house. As he drove away, he took one last look in the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and empty, its shadows stretching out into the night. And in that final glance, he thought he saw a figure standing on the porch, a faint silhouette watching him leave. But this time he didn't feel afraid. He nodded a quiet goodbye and turned his eyes back to the road, leaving the house and its memories behind. In the days that followed, Mike often found himself drawn to places that were abandoned or quiet, places where the world seemed to stand still. He'd read about other old homes, forgotten corners of the city, and places where people claimed to feel presences lingering. He didn't know if he was chasing the past, but he felt a sense of duty, a desire to remember the forgotten, to understand the lost. Occasionally he would tell people his story, though few believed him. But that was fine with him. It wasn't about convincing others. It was about keeping a promise, honoring a spirit who'd finally found peace, and knowing that sometimes the shadows held more than just darkness. And though he would never fully understand why Eleanor had chosen him, or why he had felt compelled to help her, he felt grateful for the experience. It had shown him a world beyond the ordinary, a world where the living and the lost could share a fleeting, fragile connection. Years later, he would find himself standing at the edge of other abandoned places, feeling that same chill, that same whisper in the wind. And in those moments, he would remember Eleanor Gray and the silent gift she'd left him, the ability to see the unseen, to hear the forgotten. And somewhere in the quiet shadows, he felt sure that she was watching, grateful and finally free.